And now we are on to embossing with your Big Shot machine. Now when it comes to embossing, we're talking about putting a raised pattern into your paper. And typically it is done with embossing folders. Now embossing folders have a raised edge and then they have a debossed, or a raised side and a debossed side. So they fit into each other, and when you put your cardstock into there and then run it through your machine, it presses that pattern into the paper. So this is how we do it. So we open up that first tab, we put our plate down, and then we put our embossing folder down. I typically put the folded edge towards the center so that that goes through first. I've never had an issue if I've done the other way, but I've heard people have an issue because the pressure is coming here and then it just puts pressure onto that spine and sometimes it cracks the embossing folder. Again, I've never had an issue, but I do typically put that folded edge towards the center so that goes through first and any pressure can be displaced. So then we're going to put our top plate over top of it and we're going to run it through. And that simple motion puts that pattern from that embossing folder onto that paper. So what you can do with it from there, you could leave it as is, or you can take a brush and some ink pad and ink your raised edge, or you could take an ink pad and put it directly onto your paper and ink your paper that way. There's a few different ways to do that. So you can, again, leave it as is, or emboss, or color your embossing after you're done. It depends on what type of card you're gonna want to make. It just depends on what type of card and kind of look you're looking for. So in the last section, I mentioned that you can take one of your die cuts that you've cut and you can emboss or put an embossed image in there. So we're gonna do that now. So I have got my die cut with the paper still in it, and I've got my embossing folder. I'm going to use this with the embossing folder open. I've chosen which side I want to be embossed, and I decided for this particular one I want my butterflies to be raised out. So any of the raised butterflies, I'm putting my die cut in front of or on top of that. So I've got my multi-purpose platform with the top tab open. I've got my bottom plate there, my embossing folder opened up with my die cut on top of it. I'm going to put my rubber pad on there and those couple sheets of cardstock, and I'm going to run it through. Now I can feel that feels a little bit too tight, so don't force it. If you feel that it's too tight, do not force it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this bottom tab. And that feels much better. It's still a little bit tighter than embossing with a regular embossing folder or whatnot. It still feels a little bit tighter, but that's fine. You don't want to force it through if it's too tight. You can kind of feel if it's just too tight, but that first one, it wasn't tight enough. I could just kind of, that first one was too tight, so I opened it up just to give it some extra room. So here is my die cut. So I've got that embossed image right in there. Those butterflies are embossed up. And there you go, an embossed die cut. Another product they came out with many years ago actually are embossing diffusers. Now what these do is they leave an area that is not embossed. So when you go to emboss a full embossing folder regularly, you're going to get that entire thing embossed. What you are going to do with these diffusers, see how it's an open piece of plastic? You're going to put it in, you're going to replace one of your cutting plates with this, and that relieves any pressure from this area, so that embossing is not going to go in that area. So let's show you how to do this. So I've got my piece of paper, I've got my embossing folder here, multi-purpose platform with the top tab open. I am going to put there's my plate down, my embossing folder, and then I'm going to put my diffuser down here. And then run it through. Now see how, might be a little bit difficult to see. So see how the embossing is just around the edges there, but there's no embossing in the center. So what I can do now is I could stamp an image, or I could put a verse or whatnot in there, in that area that's not embossed. Or I could leave it as is, just as a focal point. Now this works best when you have an all over pattern embossing folder like this here. And again, these embossing diffusers may be hard to find now. I'm not sure if they are discontinued or not, but you could easily make yourself one if there's something that you wanted to do that sort of look with. If you have oval dies, you can cut several layers of cardstock. You're going to want it to be quite thick and use that to emboss. Replace your one cutting plate and use that as your embossing diffuser. Or if you have some steel rule dies, you can do some chipboard. So there is a way to do it without buying these embossing diffusers, but if you come across them, they're just a really neat look and something a little bit different. Another technique that you can do is you can ink your embossing folders before embossing them. So that is what I did with this particular folder here. So what you're going to do is you want to ink the debossed side, because if you ink the side where all those little bits are raised, then all those little bits are what's going to be, for this, in this instance, blue, and it's going to be pressed in. So you just take your ink pad and rub it all over your embossing folder so you've got it completely covered. Now the one thing to note about this is make sure when you are done this that you take a wet cloth and you clean your embossing folder, because there's nothing more annoying than wanting to do something with white paper and finding that you haven't cleaned your embossing folder and getting a different color over a project that you're working on. So again, multi-purpose platform with the top tab open. Actually, no, I opened that one there. So top tab open. Embossing folder with the plate below, paper in that's inked, or the embossing folder is inked, and now I'm putting my plate on top and through. And just like that, I have a background that is embossed as well as inked. So then I can go here, this is a little snowy background, so I could put a little cabin, or I could put a snowman die cut, or whatever you want. But just a different way to get a different look, 2 steps in one. So this is the butterfly one that I went and inked the background and then did that too. I clearly didn't do a really good job inking it because there's some white spots, but it just gives it a bit of a different look to it. And just something fun to play with. Now recently, they've just come out with 3D embossing folders. So there's a brick one of a regular embossing folder and a 3D embossing folder. The 3D folders are really quite thick. They give you so much more dimension in your paper when you're embossing it. This is the 2 of them embossed there. And so this is the regular one. And this is the 3D one. You can see there's just so much more dimension. If you look at the back of them, you can tell that this one, there's just so much more dimension when it was embossed. So it does need to be embossed a little bit differently from a regular embossing folder because that folder is so much thicker. So let me show you how to do that. So the first thing I need to do is I'm going to use a little misting bottle and I'm going to mist my paper. Doesn't need to be wet, just slightly misted. What that's going to do, it's going to soften the paper fibers. I'm going to put that in my folder. I'm going to close it. I have removed the bottom cutting plate, so I have my multi-purpose platform, the top tab open, remove the cutting plate on the bottom, so there's no plate there. I'm only using one of the plates with the 3D folders. This is to get the correct thickness. Then I'm going to put my plate over top and I'm going to run it through. And there we go, we've got it embossed. Now because I used the mister and I misted my paper, I need to now let this set aside and completely dry before I do anything with it. But here's something that you can do with it. So once my paper was completely dried, I put an embossing pad on top and then I put a bunch of different embossing glazes to make those bricks really pop out. This particular, that first one I did in white, this one I did in gray just because I wanted the lines to be a little bit more subtle. but just to give you an idea of what you can do with it once it is dry. Another thing that you can do with it, because you get so much dimension when you're embossing, you can use color core paper. So this particular paper is a tealy green color, but it's got a black surface to it. So once it's done embossing and I've set it aside to dry, I can take a sanding block and sand it and reveal some of that color. So this comes in a whole bunch of different colors. It's been around for years, but just something a little bit different that you can do with it. Just give you a little idea. So these 3D embossing folders don't just come in all over background patterns. They come in some beautiful images. So this is how we use those. Exactly the same as before. We are going to mist our paper just lightly. We're going to place it on here. Now this particular folder is a little bit longer, so I should have had a bigger piece of paper, but I'm just going to make it work. So I'm going to put my paper where I want the embossed image to be. Again, multi-purpose platform, top tab open, no cutting plate, just one top plate with the 3D folder. Now I've got that beautiful embossing in there. So I see it's not quite as embossed here. What you can do in that instance is you can take the embossing folder, if you know that you have a folder that's got a little bit more detail to it, run it through a couple times. Go back and forth. I would do about 3 times just to get all of that detail pressed right into there. And once again, you're going to set this aside to completely dry before you do anything. This is what I did to it once it was dry. All I did was take some different colored ink pads and my blending brushes, rub them in the ink pad and then rub them on the card on the different areas. Now again, because it's embossed, if I press this brush really, really hard, I'm gonna get a pink halo around here. So I only do it lightly just to highlight some of the detail from some of that embossing folder. I always think less is more, so I tend to do a little bit less, but you still get the idea. Now last but certainly not least are 3D embosslets. So what these are 3D embossing folders that have a blade in them or have a die built right in them. So it's going to emboss and it's going to die cut your paper all at once. So this is what it looks like right there. So it's got a ton of detail in that embossing folder, and then it also die cuts. So this is how you do that. So I've got a piece of paper here. I'm going to cut it to size. Just making sure that it covers the embossing folder, or just basically the blades. It doesn't need to cover the entire embossing folder. Again, I'm going to mist my paper lightly. Just soften up those paper fibers. Lay them into the folder. Once again, multi-purpose platform, top tab open. I don't have a bottom plate. I just put my 3D folder in there, and then I'm gonna put my cutting plate here. And again, I've got my folded edge of the embossing folder going in first. However, with this particular one, it's got so much detail to it that I'm gonna go back and forth a couple times just to make sure to press that detail right in there. So this comes right out. I'll typically try to tap it to see if I can get those pieces out. One of them did. The other one didn't, but what I can do is I can use my little piercing tool to poke it out a little bit. Look at all that detail in there. I'm not sure the camera's even showing it really well. Lots of detail in there. But look at this done in with this holographic paper. Isn't that beautiful? Let's do that one. So again, I'm going to cut my paper to size. So this, you can buy metallic paper, holographic paper. What it is a cardstock that's got a coating. This particular one, like I said, is holographic. You can get the metallic in all sorts of different colors, gold, silver, green, yellow, red, all sorts of different colors. But it's absolutely beautiful and it's super easy to die cut. It die cuts just like regular cardstock. So especially for Christmas cards, that sort of thing, it's absolutely beautiful, and it just ups the level of your card with very little effort. because the cardstock itself is so impressive. So I'm only going to mist the back side of it because it's got the coating on the front. I don't really need to mist that because it's not going to go through the paper. So put it in the folder. Again, multi-purpose platform, top tab open, 3D folder, plate on top. I'm going to run it through this way and that way. I'm going to do it 3 times. And then take your piece out. That one doesn't want to come out this time. So let's just take our piercing tool and it just comes right out. Oops, look how beautiful that is. So pretty. So when it comes to these type of things, what I'll often do is ink the edges just to give it a little bit of extra dimension before using it on my project. And there we go.